Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
It's been hot in Wisconsin this summer, with nearly 40 days of above-average heat. That can be a serious health concern for people who work outdoors, but there aren't many protections for heat safety on the job. Kate McCoy directs the Occupational Health and Safety Surveillance Program at the State Department of Health Services. She co-wrote a report last year that shows heat is a concern for workers here in Wisconsin. Lake Effect's Xcaret Nuñez is joined by McCoy to talk about the dangers of high heat in the workplace and ways to stay safe.
A report you co-authored last year says heat stress on the job could be a bigger problem as climate change starts to make days hotter. What kind of things are we worried about?
In the worst case scenario, heat can kill. People are not meant to work in very hot conditions without proper protections in place. So we really need to make sure that workers and employers are aware that this is a real threat, that it can overtake somebody very quickly, that it can affect even young and healthy individuals, and that even when the worst doesn't come to pass, that heat can take its toll on people's health generally, can cause organ damage, kidney damage, heart damage, and overall it can just make life miserable for people on the job, right? Raise a lot of other risks along the way. So there are certain things that employers and workers can do to avoid those worst case scenarios, and we want to make sure that the public is aware of those.
And in this report, you looked at different jobs and occupations that reported problems with heat and filed workers' compensation claims. What are some of the fields you looked at?
So in that particular report, like you said, we were looking at workers' compensation claims. So that's one way that you can get at who is affected by heat. And in that data, we saw a lot of the claims were from folks like firefighters, protective service workers, people operating heavy machinery, people working in manufacturing. And more generally, we know those are people who are at risk, but there's even a broader group than we are able to show with that data source. So really, anyone who does outdoor work in hot conditions without proper precautions in place can be at risk. So you think about your construction sites, landscaping, agriculture, utility workers, delivery drivers, all those folks and more. And then indoor workers can also be at substantial risk. So if you think of stuffy, hot spaces or a location where there's equipment that radiates a lot of heat, all of a sudden, even if it's not terribly hot outside, those spaces can become very hot inside. Think about a warehouse, think about a hot kitchen, think about a stuffy attic that someone is removing asbestos from, where it's much hotter up there than it is outside. All of a sudden, those can become very risky environments. So really, there are a lot of workers who can be at risk under the wrong conditions.
So workers who are experiencing heat illness, what are some of the common signs and symptoms that coworkers and employers should watch out for when they're working outside or in stuffy, hot places, like you mentioned?
So the most dangerous things are, if somebody starts passing out, if they start seizing, having seizures, if they are acting confused or abnormal or slurred speech, that's an immediate 911 call. And there's some other things we can talk about that need to happen right then. But there are also earlier signs and symptoms that people need to pay attention to. If you're feeling dizzy, lightheaded, if you're getting nauseous or vomiting, or getting a real headache or cramps on the job when it's hot, those are a few of the symptoms to be aware of. And really, I would say to people who are working in hot conditions, if it feels uncomfortably hot to you and you're feeling off, start paying attention to it right then.
And something else that I found really interesting too was that the report noted that workers who would file worker compensation claims for heat-related illnesses were often denied. Can you talk more about that finding and why you and your co-authors found that concerning?
Isn't that an interesting finding? Yes, it is something that we wanted to call out in that data because we know this is a bigger and bigger concern for more people, not just in Wisconsin. And it was surprising to us that we were seeing more and more denials in the claims. We're not sure exactly why that is. We are in contact with folks who work with insurers and workers' comp generally and really trying to get the word out about that finding. But what we want to make sure is that people are not being dissuaded or discouraged from bringing up these claims or for coming forward and saying, I need medical help, and this happened on the job. People need that income if they are injured or sickened on the job. They need that to cover the hours that they've lost after they were downed by heat. And we also need that information because, like we used in our report, it's one of the ways that we can try to keep track of how many people are affected. So it's problematic when people are dissuaded from being able to make those legitimate claims.
And just to add on to that, I was wondering, when you're looking at worker compensation claims and the reasons for filing injuries related to heat, what are some of those common injuries?
We were looking more narrowly at things that were classified as heat-related illness, but it's a great question because that's part of the reason why it can be harder to identify all of these situations, because oftentimes a heat-related emergency doesn't get written down as such. So we know, for instance, on death records, oftentimes when someone dies due to complications from heat, it's not heat-related illness that is on the death certificate. It's going to be the more immediate heart attack or organ failure, things like that. And so I have a colleague in other states who makes it her business to look into those situations and call the coroner back and discuss what's on the death certificate, because it's not that it's wrong per se, but it's that a lot of different things can contribute to heat deaths. So we don't see them as much as you'd like because they get kind of accidentally hidden in those ways. Also, in some of the data that we've seen, people will start to get foggy headed, start to lose consciousness, and they'll fall off of some place. Like there's an example of a lifeguard falling off the chair poolside and hitting that hard pool surface, that concrete. And then, that injury is what gets reported primarily versus what caused them to fall. So it's a great question. A lot of times we don't see all of the heat cases in the data because heat causes other things, and that's what it gets categorized as.
That's so interesting. So it seems like a lot of follow-up.
Yes.
Well, reflecting on what we've talked about so far, what's your message to employers on how to create a safe workspace outdoors and indoors?
Absolutely. So there are things that employers can do that make a huge difference. The sort of tagline for both employers and workers, the shortcut is water, rest, shade. But when we break it down, here's kind of some of the things it looks like. So if you're an employer, that shade part is really about how do you put measures in place that counteract heat, whether that's air conditioning, shaded areas, exhaust ventilation, using misters, giving out specialized cooling PPE, things like that. So that's one thing that you can do to just reduce the heat risk. For indoor environments, another thing you can do is insulate equipment that produces a lot of heat. The other thing is make scheduling adjustments. So that might be scheduling some of that heavier lifting, heavier work during cooler parts of the day or at night. It might mean slowing down your production schedules enough to get those rest breaks in. And I try to tell businesses, go slow to go fast here. Our productivity is already down in hot weather. And so even though it might feel bad for employers to say we're going to build in rest breaks when you feel a lot of pressure, note that those rest breaks are refreshing your workforce and keeping people sharp, and it keeps them from being sick, and it also keeps them from making expensive mistakes with equipment. Build those things into your schedules. If you have new folks on the job, make sure that they have time to acclimatize, let their bodies get used to heat. We know that 70% of heat-related fatalities on the job take place during the first week of work because people's bodies just need that time to get used to it. So that's one thing that can be done. Also, for both the employer and the frontline supervisors and workers to know the signs and symptoms of heat-related illness, post information about the signs and symptoms and the 911 calls and the emergency response that you need to enact, and just spend a little bit of time training on it. And most importantly is tell your workers that it's okay for them to speak up sooner rather than later when they're feeling the effects of heat, because too often people push through, and that's when some of the scariest scenarios happen.
How would you also encourage workers and coworkers to watch out for themselves when they're working outside?
hopefully their employers are looking out for them, but it's important also for workers to know what to do and to take responsibility for their own health and well-being. Pay attention, like we said, to any of the symptoms that we've mentioned. Get water, rest, and shade as needed. There is an OSHA heat safety app, which I encourage both employers and workers, and really anyone can use to sort of help you gauge what's the risk in general on any given day. And it also has information about the signs and symptoms, what to look out for, and what to do in an emergency. So that's really a handy thing to have on your phone. The other thing I say to people is know your own risk factors. So there are things that can affect people's susceptibility to heat. Things like if you have pre-existing conditions, so be aware of those things. And then look out for one another. That's really important. A lot of the heat emergencies happen when someone is on their own and they don't get tended to right away. And so if you can implement a buddy system, check in with one another on hot days, those are really little things that can help you keep one another safe on the job.
The report also notes that federal and state level protections are needed to keep people safe from heat at work. Is this something you're noticing lawmakers at both the federal and state levels are working on?
Yes and no. So there is an effort right now federally that has been going on for a while to get national heat protections through OSHA. So ever since the Occupational Safety and Health Administration was formed, there have been people who've been saying we need heat protections. And now that process is farther along than it's ever been. It's an active, what's called a rulemaking process right now. But like a lot of things federally right now, there's a lot of uncertainty around whether or not that will go into place. It is positive that it's moving forward at this point. Also, Senator Baldwin from Wisconsin and some other of her colleagues have, from their position, sort of reinforced the need for a federal standard and proposed federal heat legislation, which pretty much backs what OSHA is trying to put into place. So those are really good signs federally. We don't have anything at the state level currently, and that would be nice to have since the future is uncertain right now about whether or not there'll be a federal heat law. That's another avenue that could be pursued, and there are states that have heat protections in place.
And before we wrap up, I want to ask you why it's important to have these conversations surrounding heat-related illness in the workplace and protections for them too.
Yeah, absolutely. These are simple things that can save a life, right? There are no employers, no supervisors who wake up in the morning and say, gee, I hope something terrible happens on my work site today. Nobody wants that to happen. But these are things that can happen, and they happen all the time in hot weather. So by knowing these simple things that people can do, we're hopeful that workplaces can stay safe, that people can remain healthy and on the job for as long as they're able.
Absolutely. Well, Kate, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciated learning more about your research on heat in the workplace.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kate McCoy is a program director for the Occupational Health and Safety Surveillance Program at the State Department of Health Services. She also co-wrote a report last year on heat risk in the workplace. She spoke with Lake Effect's Xcaret Nuñez.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.